Hello and welcome to the first session of the NLF Imaginary Lines Book Club for Children with Veera Hiranandani around her book, The Night Diary. We're very excited to be here and we hope you are too. The Night Diary received the prestigious Newbery Honor in 2019. In addition, the book also received the 2019 Walter Dean Myers Honor Award and the 2018 Malka Pen Award. The Night Diary is a New York Times Editor's Choice pick and was chosen as a 2018 Best Children's Book of the Year by the New York Times, the Washington Post, NPR, Amazon, and School Library Journal, among others. Veera is also the author of The Whole Story of Half a Girl, which was named a Sidney Taylor Notable Book and a South Asian Book Award finalist, and the chapter book series Phoebe G. Green. She teaches creative writing at Sarah Lawrence College and is working on her next novel. We think that a virtual book club ties in with the theme of imaginary lines for NLF Online very well this year, as it helps us come together, blurring the boundaries that separate us. The Night Diary aligns with this idea in many ways, as it speaks about a subject that has impacted identities on both sides of the line that partition etched into our national history in 1947. The book speaks of other imaginary lines too, that the protagonist, 12-year-old Nisha, constructs for herself. Entries in her diary that connect her to her mother, who is no more. The bonds that hold Nisha's family together as they make the arduous journey to a new land. The length of time that separates her from a loved one. And the fresh lines that form as their lives reshape and take on new meaning. Before we dive into the session, here are a few points to remember. You can ask your questions using the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. If you raise your virtual hand, we would not be able to attend to your question. Hence, we recommend that you use the Q&A box to share your questions with us. We will be putting up a few polls during the webinar in order to engage with you further and would love for you to participate in the same. And now, without further ado, we bring you Veera Hiranandani and The Night Diary. Over to you, Veera.
Thank you. I'm really excited to be with you today. I was able to travel to Bangalore last year for the Neve Literature Festival, and it was really one of the highlights in my writing career. So it was a really special event, and I'm glad that I can be part of it in this way this year, in a very different year, online, and share with you some of my sort of the inspiration that brought me to writing this book. It took me many years, and a lot of times writers are sort of writing things in their minds when they are not even aware of it. So you're sort of working on a book kind of in your head for a long time before you even start writing it. So I have spent years thinking about this book, and now it came out in 2018. I've spent years at this point talking and sharing this book with readers, which has been tremendous and an incredible experience. And I'm just really amazed and touched about how many people, both in the US and India and all over the world, have been interested in the story of partition. And that was really one of my main goals, in the sense that I don't really have an agenda when I'm writing. Ultimately, I really try to think of the story I want to tell and the characters that I'm writing about. But because my father experienced partition, had to leave his home in Pakistan and go to Jodhpur and then eventually Bombay, it was something that I grew up in the US hearing my father talk about, my aunts and uncles talk about. And of course, I had a lot of questions of what this history meant to me and to my identity, and why the partition happened to begin with. And so I grew up with those questions, and I didn't know that I would grow up to be a writer, but when I did, I felt like it was really important to share this story and as the next generation of somebody who survived partition, to preserve that history, because partition survivors are now in their, my father's in his 80s, and people are in their 80s, 90s, or no longer living. And so I think it's so important for a generation who has a connection to preserve the history in whatever way we can. So it doesn't sort of go with that generation, because there's so much we can still learn, and we never want to forget that it happened and why it happened. So that was part of the, what I wanted to do with this book. But then ultimately I wanted to write an engaging story. So I'm going to read a few pages for you to start off. And I know that many of you have probably read the first chapter, or the first diary entry. So I'm going to read the next few that follow, just a few pages. They're sort of short. Some of the diary entries are longer and some are shorter. And I can talk a little bit more about why that is. But right now, I'm going to start. Okay. July 15th, 1947. Dear Mama, I only have time to tell you one thing tonight because my eyelids are heavier than wet sheets. Papa is very mad. I knew he would be when he found out. Amil's headmaster sent over a message. Mine did not. When Papa found out, he made Amil sit in the corner with no breakfast this morning. Amil didn't ask why I wasn't being punished, even though Papa must have known I skipped too. I guess the difference is that I do well in school and Amil doesn't. I only ate one of my chapatis and wrapped the other in a napkin. Then I stuck it in my school book for Amil when no one was looking. I think Kazi likes us best. Papa loves us, of course, because he's our father, and Dottie loves us because she's our grandmother. That's what they're supposed to do. But Papa is too busy to do a lot of liking, and Dottie is too old. Papa works every day, even on Sunday. I guess he has to since he's a doctor. People leave gifts on our doorstep all the time, like flowers and sweets for the wonderful things he has done. Sometimes I think Papa's not real. He leaves early in the cool morning air and never makes a sound. Sometimes when he comes back late at night and kisses me goodnight in my sleep, I wake up and see him. It feels like I'm dreaming. Love, Nisha. Okay, and then the next entry, July 16, 1947. Dear Mama, Kazi has so much energy for us. He always has. When we were younger, maybe 5 or 6, he used to sit cross-legged on the floor and play with us after his work was done. I remember he was the first person to teach Amil how to play cricket in front of the house, how to throw and bat and catch. Papa never did. I would peer out of the window and watch them, laughing hard when Amil missed the ball, since he could hardly see me. I help Kazi in the kitchen all the time, even though Dottie doesn't want me to. She says I'll marry well and have someone cook for me, just like Kazi does for us. But that doesn't sound like any fun at all. I can't wait to be older and do what Kazi does. He lets me help him more all the time. I know how to sort the lentils, grind the spices with his marble mortar and pestle, clarify the butter for ghee, and mix the dough for chapatis. I usually finish my schoolwork fast and sneak into the kitchen when Dottie thinks I'm working to help Kazi prepare dinner. He sees me even when he's not looking up. It's like he smells me. He turns and holds a handful of peas to be shelled. I like to cook things even more than I like to eat them. How does Kazi take all these plain, boring foods, bitter vegetables, dried lentils, flour, oil, spices, and turn them into something so warm and delicious every time? Love, Nisha. July 17th, 1947. Dear Mama, Kazi was right. I was made for writing in a diary. I'd much rather write than talk. I talk very little. Mostly just to Amil and Kazi. I feel normal around them. I talk to Dottie and Papa if I have to, but for the rest of the world, the words just don't want to come out, like part of my mouth or my brain is broken. It feels scary to talk, because once the words are out, you can't put them back in. But if you write words and they don't come out the way you want them to, you can erase them and start over. I have the neatest handwriting in my class and get the highest marks on all my compositions. You would be very proud of me. Amel likes to talk, he likes to run, he likes to laugh, he likes to yell, but he hates writing anything down, except for his drawings. The teachers think he's stupid because he can't read and doesn't do his schoolwork, but they should look at his drawings. Amel draws all sorts of things. Sometimes he draws frightening scorpions and snakes with dark charcoal pencil. He draws every leg, every bump, every little detail. Sometimes he draws me early in the morning when I'm sleeping. It's strange to look at myself that way, but I like it. It makes me feel like I'm not alone, like someone is always watching over me. Are you, Mama? Sometimes Amel draws Daddy or Papa when they aren't looking and only shows me. He draws Kazi cooking. He likes to paste lots of paper scraps together with flour and water to make a bigger drawing space. Kazi once gave him a drawing pad. Amel only does his best work on the paper. After he practices on his bits of flour bags, ends of newspaper, whatever he can find. He let me touch the drawing pad paper once. It's cloud white, silky smooth. I wonder why Amel is the way he is. I wonder why I am the way I am. I bet you know. Love, Nisha. So I'm going to leave it there and now talk more about, there's a lot of sun coming in my office here. I'm going to talk more about my process of writing the book and sort of take you through that. And I am going to just share my screen for 1 second. Bear with me because it usually takes me a little while to do that. Hold on. Okay. Okay. Now it should. Okay. So hopefully you guys can see that. So my writing journey started when, a little before a few years ago. This is me, a lot younger. And writing was something that always came naturally to me in the sense that, not that I was, when people say that, I think people assume that it means that I was this great writer from the very beginning. And I'm still trying to be a great writer. So that journey never ends. But also it was more just how I thought of the world and how I interpreted the world. So I was also pretty shy and spent a lot of time kind of quietly observing the world that I was in. And a lot of times I would have questions, but I was afraid to ask them. I always felt like they would be silly or stupid or things that I just wasn't supposed to ask. So I would write and I would make up stories to kind of play out the things that I was thinking about. And that was a part of me from very young, and I don't really know why. And I was always I enjoyed plays and I wrote poetry and I put together these little newspapers for my younger sister. So I was always trying to kind of create that way. And that was something that was always, it followed me as I grew up, and I didn't know I could sort of write as a job when I was younger. And so I just kept doing it because I really loved it. And I think that's really the core, that if anybody wants to be a writer, it's something that you find pleasurable and interesting, and that you just want to do it for the sake of doing it, not necessarily for the sake of getting published in that way. So I really always wrote for the love of it. And I read a lot too, and that always helps any writer develop their own voice, and you start to learn what stories you engage you the most and what stories you can't connect to, and then you develop your own style. So also a lot of times when I talk about writing, this question comes up: where do I get my ideas? And usually, it's in some ways it's a very common question that authors get asked all the time. And it's also really hard to answer because a lot of times, I'm sorry, I keep moving because I feel like the sun is brighter than I would like it to be. Okay. So I feel like sometimes ideas just come to you, and I have always written about things that I was interested in, but also really confused about. So the partition certainly fits well into that category. And, you know, I would hear stories from my father, from my aunts and uncles, and they would talk about how they had to leave, and they would use the word partition. And they would, you know, sort of mention that they had to get on a train and leave everything behind. And then they started over in Jodhpur, and then eventually moved to Mumbai. And I just, a lot of times it was never really explained sort of why this happened. And a lot of times when I was really little, you know, growing up in the US, nobody else had this story around me. I didn't hear this story anywhere in school or from any other person in my community. And my cousins and I, on the Indian side of my family, my mother's not from India. You know, she grew up in the US and she's Jewish American. So I have a mixed background. So on the Indian side of my family, you know, my cousins and I, we didn't really talk about it too much. We would just sort of hear the stories and then just be young and run out and play and not really ask too many questions. But I certainly wondered why this happened. And a lot of times I thought it was just something that happened to my father's family. I didn't understand the magnitude. But it sort of stayed with me. And, you know, it was certainly something that I felt like I really wanted to investigate when I became a writer, but I wasn't ready. It wasn't my first book. You know, I wrote a book more about my own background growing up in Connecticut, and that's my first book, The Whole Story of Half a Girl. I also have a chapter book series called Phoebe G. Green, which is for slightly younger kids, and it's more about just what I think about food culture in America and how often in the US, you know, we tell kids, you know, you can just eat this food, but you shouldn't try this food because you wouldn't like it because you're a kid. And I felt a little frustrated with that growing up because I wanted my kids to taste all kinds of foods because my parents are from two different cultures. You know, I grew up with many different kinds of foods in the household. And so I wrote a book sort of inspired by that because that was another question I was kind of interested in and confused about. And so I started thinking, how would I shape a story around the partition of India? You know, what kind of research would I do? What kind of lens would I put on it? And so I was sort of thinking about the book and reading and asking questions and sort of doing informal research for many years before I kind of got the courage to write about it. But, you know, ultimately my process is, so you have an idea, how do you make a story out of that idea? So yes, I had an idea about a story for young people because I felt like the memories from my father were from his young self, you know, and from my aunts and uncles. Those stories were from the perspective of a 9, 10, 11, 12-year-old. They weren't from the perspective of an adult kind of knowing sort of more of an intellectual academic sense of the history. It was more kind of a raw experience of what you would feel like and not fully understand it and kind of go through all the steps and all the events that happened around you. And at the same time, have this really innocent view of just the questions, well, why were communities living peacefully? Certainly my father's community, you know, the way he talks about it, Muslims, Hindus, Sikhs, everybody together, there wasn't a lot of conflict. There was a lot of sharing in cultures and traditions. And then suddenly the lines were drawn. And in some ways imaginary lines, right? Because all borders are human created. So we create them for different reasons, and sometimes they're necessary and sometimes they're not. So in that sense, tying into this theme, they're also kind of arbitrary and imaginary in that sense. And so once these lines were drawn, that's when all of the conflict, or a lot of the conflict, started. And so I had a question about that. Why would that change things so quickly? Why were people so kind of aware of their religious identity, and why was that causing, the tremendous amount of conflict that it did, and unfortunately still does. So that was my idea. But what you need is, to make an idea a story, is really a character with a problem. So a main character with a problem makes a story out of an idea. And that's what I needed. I needed the main character to shape the entire story around. I mean, your main character does so much work. It's really everything. So I don't think you can fully start a story and really fully understand what you're trying to do until you have that main character very clearly in your mind. And for me, ultimately, it became Nisha. But for a while, I started a story, not in diary format. Those were my first attempts at writing what is now the Night Diary. But this story for young people with a young narrator about the partition of India, I kind of was modeling it after my dad, because that was my main sort of resource in that way, and my main influence, and the main reason of why I was trying to understand this: my dad, my grandparents, my aunts and uncles. So I started a story in a third person point of view rather than first person. So he did this, he did that, a young male narrator. And I was just kind of thinking of what his life would have been like, kind of based on what my father had told me. And I was sort of playing out his story. But then I started doing more research and reading, adult nonfiction, more academic work, and then also kind of personal accounts that I could find, collections. So something like, The Great Partition by Yasmin Khan, or I read, there was a collection, The Other Side of Silence. And I certainly read, novels based on partition, as many as I could find, more for adults. And there aren't a lot. And so I would and then I would watch documentaries and fictional movies, and trying to get as many perspectives as I could, because I wanted to follow different experiences. So a family traveling, Hindu family traveling in the direction that my father's family traveled, a Muslim family traveling in the other direction, Sikh families, sometimes, smaller stories about the Parsi experience or the Jain experience and things like that. And I wanted to make sure that I kind of collected anecdotes and experiences from as many different perspectives, because I felt like that was then the lens that I could put on it. And I felt like the male main character wasn't really, it was too close to my father's story and too close to this one single story where they had to leave, and it was scary, and it was there was a lot of loss, but they got on a train and they made it over the border safely, and they started their new life. And then eventually, a few years later, went to Mumbai. And then my father came to the US in his early 20s. And so there were so many more aspects that I wanted and hoped to include. And I felt a little limited by that. And so I sort of moved the male character over and came up with Nisha, who was closer to who I am personality-wise. And I had this idea that I wanted her to come from a mixed background, because I felt like I could kind of push a lot of the questions to the forefront if Nisha, while her country is being split in half, has an identity to both sides in a sense. But I was also most familiar with the sort of Hindu story of a Hindu family traveling from Pakistan to India. So I felt like my main character, I wasn't going to be intimately connected enough through her eyes telling the Muslim story of partition. I felt like that would be for somebody, another author. But I wanted to incorporate that identity, and I wanted to ask the question because I come from an interfaith background as well. So the two religions in my family are Judaism and Hinduism, and how I've sort of grown up trying to incorporate both aspects in my life, and often never feel kind of enough of one thing or another, and at the same time feel not only connected to both of my backgrounds, and not just in a religious way and a cultural way, but it gives me almost a flexibility to connect with a lot of people in a lot of different backgrounds. And I find myself often playing the role of kind of a bridge, or somebody who wants to kind of bring different people together. And so I really wanted to try to do that in my work. So I had this idea that Nisha would have a Muslim mother who was no longer living. So it was about her reflection on that identity. But I think the family, if Nisha's mother was living, the family would have made different choices. Whether they would leave, would one parent convert or another, would they stay? So their story would be different. So I felt like this was a way to kind of, in a way, solve that story problem, where it could give me both perspectives, and that Nisha could write to her in a diary. But I started where I knew that the mother wasn't living anymore, and Nisha was writing in a diary, because I also felt like she was very shy, and a diary would be a way for her to kind of ask all the questions she wants to ask and have the reader see that. But also I thought it'd be interesting to see her move around in the world, and the reader to also see how much she struggled with kind of asking those questions outside of her diary. So that was another problem I wanted to give Nisha. So the problem of, how to express herself, and then of course the problem of the events happening all around her. You certainly don't have to search far if you're going to set a story during partition of what kinds of conflicts the characters might have. So it was really just making it believable in that way. And I just want to make sure I'm good on time. So those were some of the things I was trying to incorporate with the diary format. But then when I figured out that Nisha was actually writing to her mother, because I didn't make that direct connection, I kind of had this diary going along, and it was kind of the sort of a bare foundation of what you see, but there was something missing, something that wasn't quite driving her, why she needed to kind of tell all these things. Who is she talking to? And a lot of times when we write a journal or a diary, we're talking to ourselves. So I think Nisha is doing that. But I wanted some other pull. I wanted some other reason for her to be turning to this diary. And so when I figured out, oh, she's writing to her mother, even though I knew her mother was no longer living, that connected everything. And then the book really started to flow from there. But that whole process that I just explained, of really just getting to the point of figuring out the main character and what she wants and how I was going to structure it, took several years. And then I started like the real first draft. So often I tinker around a lot before I start this sort of first draft. And then there are many drafts after that. But so, I'm speaking to an audience in India. So often when I go to US schools, I really have to explain. What the partition is. A lot of people haven't heard of it at all. In history books, it's often just a line of India's independence, maybe a mention of, and then Pakistan was created, and that's it. And so often I'm really explaining, what India looked like. Picture showing very general lines of what it looked like before and after partition and after 1971 with the creation of Bangladesh. So I sort of take my audience step by step through those lines and how they were created by the British, and how the whole process was rushed, and how Pakistan was actually in two places, right? And so people were going in different directions that way. And it wasn't necessarily intended that Hindus would, be in the new India and Muslims history, that is never the case. That is never the case. It never works. So it's interesting how we keep repeating those ways that we divide ourselves. So this is a map that was created for the book. And so we see Nisha's journey from Mir Prakash to Jodhpur. And then eventually my father's family went to Mumbai. And right now I'm actually working on a sequel to The Night Diary. There's a middle grade novel that will come out next year that is not connected to The Night Diary, is completely different, exploring kind of a different side of my family. And then I'm coming back to the world of The Night Diary and looking at, so what happens after people experience something like the partition of India? You know, how do the survivors rebuild their lives? And so I'm really following this family that eventually is in Mumbai, because my father spent a long time thereafter. So they were just in Jodhpur about 2 years. And then when my father goes back to India, he often thinks of Mumbai as really his hometown in that sense. And he's never been back to Pakistan, which is sad. I heard of a new project, I'm not sure what it's called, where they're following, interviewing partition survivors in their 80s or 90s who have never sort of been back to the home that they left in both Pakistan and India, and creating a virtual experience where they can go back visually to the home, literally the home that they left, and then sort of watch them experience that. And I can't remember the name of it, but I just thought that was really interesting, especially in this new virtual world, to give a chance to, somebody who's too old to actually make the trip, to be able to see the home that they left as a child. So, it's just so moving in that way. And it's interesting in the virtual space, thinking about imaginary lines, it's not necessarily where we want to be all the time on a screen. I'd much rather be interacting with people in real life. But at the same time, there's a tremendous freedom to just right now, here I am talking to you. We're all the way, US and India, and that's incredible. It's like we're all in one space together. So there is a blurring of those lines in the virtual space that is really exciting. It just can't sort of replicate or replace actual human interaction. So it'll be interesting to see how we blend those two worlds, after the pandemic, and see how we incorporate this new use of virtual space. But that's another story. So one of the things that I really tried to do was, you think about my father's family, and this is my father around age 6, and then behind him is the house in Mir Prakash that they left. And then the next picture around age 10, that might have been in Jodhpur, I'm not sure. But, I really would look at pictures of my father when he was young, and I would look at pictures of my grandfather in the middle, you can see, who was a doctor at the Mir Prakash City Hospital. And sadly, I never met him because he died before I was born. So the Papa character in the book is kind of created out of what I thought my grandfather would be like, based on my father's memories and my own imagination. And of course, there's, when you create fictional characters, you sort of take from a lot of places. It's not just that this person is this person in the book, because it's fiction, right? So you sort of have that leeway to play and blend and sort of play with the actual truth to get to another truth, another kind of truth, a more emotional truth. So there's certainly some of my father in the Papa character, but this was kind of the image I had in my head for Papa. And then on the left is my father and his younger sister, my aunt, and then my father and his older brother on the top right. And on the bottom right is my grandfather. Center is my grandmother and my aunt, my father's younger sister, and then my two aunts, his older sister and younger sister. And so certainly the Papa character, but also my grandmother, thinking about what she must have felt like as a mother with taking her children on a train and not knowing exactly what she would meet on the other side. And just now that I'm a mother, thinking about what that would feel like, just packing a few bags and leaving your home forever. I don't think a lot of people thought they were leaving their home forever. A lot of people thought it was temporary. So at the same time, it just must have been so frightening and overwhelming. All these families doing the same thing, and some families not surviving the trip. So it's really hard to think about. It's hard to kind of hold all of that in your head. But when I would look at these pictures, I would think, there's the all the kind of history that we learn about, and Jinnah and Nehru and Gandhi and the sort of facts of partition and the British and what happened and all the kind of the historical timeline that is often the known history. But ultimately, what I really wanted to discover in my own journey writing the book was, what did it feel like to go through this time, sort of regardless of what religion you were, because that's the thing that I was most struck by. And it was surprising and yet not surprising that when I would listen to hundreds of accounts of families moving in different directions. And one incredible archive is the, I think it's called the Partition Archive of 1947.org. And that organization has collected hundreds and hundreds of oral stories that videotaped and audio about people just sharing what happened, what they had to do in those few weeks, really, and then how they kind of where they ended up and how they rebuilt their lives. And one thing that really struck me was how similar these stories were. I mean, of course they were, some people experienced more violence or didn't, or had an easier time rebuilding their lives, or didn't, bigger families, smaller families. But at the same time, the sense of loss, the sense of displacement, the sense of we were all sort of, together in this harmonious community. And then once the lines were drawn, everything changed. And, communities and friends and people were just completely separated and split. And the shock of that, and still the shock of, well, how did that even happen? Was the question that I would see the most, and just the pain of that it didn't have to be that way, in a sense. And so I saw that as such a similar theme to all of the stories, and that was really what I was trying to uncover, because I'm not an academic historian. I'm ultimately, at first, I'm a fiction writer. So I really thought, how am I, little old me, who didn't even do that well in my history classes in school, how will I write this historical novel and do it well, and do it, honor the history and kind of not mess it up, in a sense. And so I felt like it was really my job to just think about my family's story, think about all the stories that I heard, and try to create just the most realistic portrayal of something, kind of opening up these questions, not necessarily answering them, of what it ultimately would feel like for this particular family in this particular situation to go through the partition of India. And what I hope it also will do is kind of even inspire more people to write different stories with different perspectives about the partition, because we hear often, one story representing, certainly me in the US, this is not representative of the partition story. This is just a fictionalized partition story. And then the way you really understand history is to have multiple stories, right? About from different perspectives. So I only hope that we can just keep opening up that avenue for more people to tell their stories, whether it's kind of historical accounts in a more factual sense, or novels inspired and movies inspired by it, things like that. So speaking of movies, I always think of the movie Gandhi because it was released in the US when I was 11. And that was a time where I think it was really pivotal for me, in the sense that, I grew up in this small town on the East Coast in Connecticut, outside of, about an hour and a half away from New York, but a very small town. And I certainly felt like the only one of me with my background in my community. Very few Indian American families, very few Jewish families, and then there was me, who had the combination, but also just the history of partition and the story that I had been hearing as a child from my father. And then we went my family, we went to see this movie. And even though it's kind of a big Hollywood depiction of all the things that happened in Gandhi's involvement in everything, it does center a lot around the partition. And I was just in shock. I couldn't believe that this was what my father had been talking about, because I didn't hear about it in school. I didn't read about it in a book. So it was sort of my first exposure to anything about the partition outside of my family. And that's when I felt like, it brought up so many questions. I thought about it growing up so many times. I watched the movie several times. And so I think I felt, even young like that I wanted to kind of ask more questions. What was this history about, kind of in my own sort of investigation of it, and wanting to put more stories out there. So, because Gandhi was really the only one I had, in a sense, at that time. So it was sort of a pivotal moment for me. And I talk about my process. I try different things. I often write many pages of something going in one direction, then decide to switch it into another direction. But when I'm really kind of more in the zone, in a draft where I'm moving forward, I really see the beginning, the middle, and the end. I do often a rough outline for my book when I'm at that point. Then I'm a pretty visual writer, so I really needed images, because I didn't live through this time, images of what things might have looked like then. So, certainly the internet has many images of the partition, and some, one thing, looking through images to sort of fill out scenes in my head. And I kind of play the novel almost like a movie in my head, and then write it down. That tends to be my approach, and the way my mind works. So in a way, I'm a very visual writer. But looking through all of the images, that was one of the hardest types of research that I did, because when you do look at images of partition, there's just so many shocking, painful images. And I felt like I wanted to balance that. I'm writing this for a young reader. So how do I write a book that gets to the truth of what happened, and kind of puts that on the line, and you see the stakes for Nisha's family, that their lives at different times are in danger, but at the same time, I don't want to traumatize a young reader. I want them to be able to get through this story in a way that a young reader could digest, at the same time not avoid the truth about what happened. So I see that I need to go through some of these images quickly so we have time for questions. But these were some of the other images that I used to create scenes in the book. And this is, refugees taking the train, and that kind of iconic image. And these are some of my favorite foods that I featured in the book. And food is really important to Nisha, because it's a way for her to express herself outside of her own, feelings. And often when I'm in the US in schools, I sort of explain all the foods and stuff, but I don't need to do that here. And so I just think about how brave my father's family was to just sort of, we often think of bravery as kind of this heroic thing that happens, superheroes, but often the most courageous acts are people that just are willing to face the unknown and put one foot in front of the other. And in a lot of ways, we're doing that now during the pandemic in a different way. But I think of that's often the real strength and the real courage that we develop as people going through whatever we have to go through. So what is your story? And it can be very ordinary, just the moment you get up every day and you're willing to kind of get through another day if you're facing obstacles, because we all are, big or small. And that's where your story is. So now I would like to open it up to questions.
Thank you, Veera. It was so interesting to listen to you talk about your process. We're all really excited to hear that there's a sequel to The Night Diary that's coming up.
Yes. In a few years, book publishing, it's a little slow.
Right, yeah. Before we get into the questions, Veera, I'll just take you through some of the polls that we launched for the event. And we've asked students, or we've asked the participants what age they are. We largely have participants between 10 and 13 years old. Most of them are from Bangalore. About 37% have read the pre-reading for the session. I'll get back to the polls in just a bit, but let me ask you some of their questions. We have a question that's coming from Arayana Gupta and Tiara Kothari, who asked you, did you write a diary yourself when you were a child?
I did. I was a big diary writer, so it was natural for me to kind of write this fictional diary. Yes. I highly recommend the practice.
Right. We also have a question from Rishan Kumar saying, was Nisha being shy based on your own personality?
Yes, I think Nisha is more of an exaggerated version. I mean, she really has kind of a social anxiety, but I was very shy, not quite as shy as Nisha, but I really understood that feeling. And especially I had to switch schools between 4th and 5th grade. And I went from a very comfortable small school where I knew everybody to not knowing anybody. And I was extremely shy for a few years. So I know what it feels like.
Nice. Yeah. It does. I mean, it comes through in the writing that you felt close to the character.
Yeah. It's not hard for me to figure out, that feeling.
Right.
Oh,
we also have,
yeah.
We also have an interesting question that's coming from Kirtana Shravya about Nisha's parents. Miss Hiranandani, why did you make Nisha's family Hindu with a Muslim mother and not Muslim with a Hindu mother? Was there a specific reason?
Right. So the real reason was that it was just where, my family is Hindu, and I felt like that was the story that I could tell in the most kind of connected way and intimate way, at the same time wanting to bring this sort of interfaith background to the book. So that was the way that I felt like I could access it in the most truthful way for me. So yeah.
Okay, excellent. We also have a question from Mrigopriya Tamuli. What books from your childhood influenced you the most?
Well, the books that I read growing up were the books available to me in the US that, were very popular books of the time. So it was more authors like Roald Dahl, like books like Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. I really loved books like by E.B. White, Charlotte's Web, books by Beverly Cleary, Judy Blume, and I'm not sure how familiar you are with those authors, but that's kind of what I grew up on, and I really loved those books, and they were kind of the base of my first longer, richer reading experiences. But I often did feel that I was not fully connecting to characters. I never saw characters that kind of had the kind of backgrounds I was coming from, and so I didn't discover that until an adult. But those books told me how to write stories, because they are just authors that create beautiful stories. So, yeah.
Nice. We also have a question and a comment from Archana Natraj, who says, her question is, did you base Kazi's character on someone from real life? And her comment was that she really loved the book.
Thank you.
There is more to the comment, but I'm not able to find it.
Yeah.
So I'll just come back to it. Yeah.
Okay.
Go ahead, Veera.
No, you finished the comment and then
okay,
there was more.
Yeah, I remember she said that she absolutely loved the book. And it's just incredible that you were able to get rather painful events across with a child's perspective. Both the fight for the water and the train incident were just brilliant.
Oh, thank you. Those were certainly probably the hardest scenes for me to write. And I'm glad that it resonated that way, because that was certainly what I hoped to do. And Kazi is a character that's probably one of the most fictional characters, not necessarily based on anybody that is very specific. It was more, all the stories that I listened to. And my father's family, they did have a cook working for them, but my dad didn't remember, too much about him. I don't know if he was Muslim or Hindu. And so it was just a way for them to have this other kind of parent figure in the book. And I wanted them, I was constantly thinking about kind of the balance in the book of the different Hindu characters and Muslim characters and what their connections and relationships would be. And then once you sort of figure that out, then the characters just they just go on a journey while you're writing. You end up and you're like, oh, wow. So this is who these characters became over this book. So it's always filled with surprises in a sense.
Right. Thanks, Veera. We have an interesting comment that's come in from Anahira Bansal. I also love to cook, but don't love to eat so much. I love those little things you described about the characters, which leads me to my question. The reason why Nisha feels so comfortable expressing herself through food, is that a thought or an idea that came from one of your experiences in life? I know you've talked about how in fiction you borrow truths from different characters and sort of build on it, so that you get to your emotional truth. Is that something that came to you from life?
Yes. So I love to cook. I actually like to eat even a little more than I like to cook. But I've always been very connected to sort of the making of food and the eating of food. And I think it's partly my parents were really not only dedicated to sort of share with us as kids their foods from their traditional background. So I always say, my favorite comfort foods are samosas and Jewish chicken matzo ball soup. So that's kind of mixing my background. But they also wanted us to taste foods from all over the world, whatever we could. We traveled a bit, and also they just shared with us a lot of foods. And I think that something about eating foods from many different places and many different cultures, I think just creates just a bigger sense of the world, even through food. It's so powerful. Not only what food can tell you about people's backgrounds, but also how they eat, what they like to eat. It really creates characters and tells you about who this person is. And I just really think that there's very little that tops the pleasure of just good food and a beautiful meal shared with family and friends. So I just feel very connected to that aspect of human life. And it's in all of my books, you'll find that. And I always remembered when I would read a scene where food is described in any book that I've sort of ever read in my life, I really remember it when food is described. So I just love using that in my writing.
Nice. That's a fascinating take on using food in writing. We also have a comment from one of our participants. The night diary is so captivating that I have seen students walking in the shoes of Nisha and living each moment, especially the perilous journey of the family takes to cross the border. This is from Ms. Meera Mohan, who's taught the book. So,
thank you.
We have one last question, Veera, from Soumya Ravindranath. If you had to recommend books about partition that present different perspectives, what would those books be?
so I'm reading a book now, and you had mentioned it, and now I'm suddenly like on the spot, and then I forget every title of every book that I've ever read for some reason. But it's by what was
Irfan
the book?
Master.
Oh, A Beautiful Lie. A Beautiful Lie, and the author is
Irfan Master.
Yes. So I think that that is really an excellent book. There's a picture book by Uma Krishnaswamy, which is called Chachaji's Cup,
Yes.
which I love as a picture book. And then, one of the best kind of nonfiction accounts, more academic but really accessible accounts of the partition is called The Great Partition by Yasmin Khan. And that was like great for just my kind of foundational learning of in a more academic sense.
Yeah.
And then the Train to Pakistan, which is a classic. I think that that's great. And Bapsi Sidhwa, Cracking India, or it's called different. I think there are two different titles.
Yeah, there's Ice Candy Man.
Right.
Okay.
So I think that's great. So those are some of the books that I read along the way.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Veera. So before we close, let me just tell our viewers that for the next session, which happens on September 11th from 5:30 to 6 p.m. IST, it'll be great if you could read through the entries till August 19th, 1947 in the book. If you do read the whole book, then that'll be great. But our next session with Veera is on September 11th, 5:30 to 6 p.m. We hope to see you then, and we hope you had a great time today. Thank you so much, Veera, for taking out the time to do this for us. It's been absolutely enlightening. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. See you.